Okay, so we're going to continue with our last day for now of Illustrator. And I'm going to talk today about architectural diagrams. And this lecture is very specifically geared toward architecture. It doesn't mean that the skills that you learn wouldn't apply to another design degree. But this is something that I find so critical to those of you that are architecture students that are moving forward that I think it's important to spend the time regardless of what major you might be in this class. So I'm going to talk thoroughly about architectural diagrams, and then we'll spend some time in the world of Illustrator actually diagramming today. I'm going to have you pick a historical building as part of your diagramming. The hope is that you can find a section and a plan of that building, and then you can develop some diagrams based on that. If you're in a studio setting and you want to diagram one of your own buildings, I'd be okay with you attempting to do that using the same techniques that we discussed. Some of you will be in that place, some of you won't. So worst case is we're going to do a historical building. Thank you, by the way. This is the point in the semester where people seem to vanish and evaporate. So those of you that are here, I very much appreciate that you're here. The hope is that if you have friends that aren't here, maybe you could nudge them and say, remember there is that class that you should go to, right? Because it's not a good sign if you're not here. And again, I'm speaking to the choir because you're all here, so it doesn't really matter. But tell your friends that they should be here too. Okay, so let's move on into the world of architectural diagrams and start talking about them. So the first thing is, what is a diagram in the first place? And so the point of a diagram is that this is a way of explaining a major design idea or a major design theory or something that represents what your building, in this case, is really about. So it's something, I think that maybe the easiest way to refer to it is the equivalent of a one-liner joke, right? Where it's just, there's not much to it. That's it. This is what it's about. So you simplify whatever your major decisions are, your major design implications, you simplify them down into something really clear and easy to understand. And that's the point. They're supposed to be clear and easy to understand. As you learn to diagram, it's not something that you'll just like, oh, I can diagram, no problem. It takes practice. And that's not a surprise. Everything in the design field takes practice. So what do? You practice, and you keep practicing. The first thing to do is to start working in your sketchbook. Really, a lot of sketches are fundamentally diagrams. So you start to draw out a building, right? You're working in 120 on your first house for your ancestors, okay? What are my big ideas about this house? And you start to sketch them out, right? Those are essentially diagrams. It's very rare that your sketches get so detailed that they're not diagrams, okay? So it's a good place to start. If you're struggling, you can always try adding some color, switching from pen to pencil, so a different medium, maybe cut out some images and collage them together, right? We, in the field of architecture, those of us that are trying to teach you, often force you to do lots of these kinds of things. You've probably had to do a collage where you cut out pieces and you glued them together, right? Some of you, okay? That is essentially a way of diagramming. We're trying to teach you these techniques along the way, even if we're not coming out and really calling them diagrams. Okay? So here's some examples. This was a sketchbook that I had in grad school that I took a picture of. What the content is makes absolutely no difference, but you can see a couple things. One, there's a combination of lines, text. In this case, there's no colors, but there's some darker pieces. Right? There is also a bunch of different pieces that were drawn wherever I had space to draw, at whatever time I had to draw, that I afterward taped back into the sketchbook. Right? So it doesn't mean you have to be drawing in the sketchbook. It just means you have to be drawing somewhere. Cut them out, stick them in. Right? Another example of one of my sketchbooks, I moved from that style sketchbook to this style sketchbook. This is a much smaller, it's a little moleskin sketchbook that has a Japanese fold. So it's one continuous piece of paper that folds up. And for me, it was great because you could just keep going. There was never an end to the page. You never turned the page over. It just kept drawing. And so you can see combination text, drawings, intermixed, random facts all kind of pushed together. That's part of what this diagramming starts with. Okay? So let's look at some actual architectural diagram types, and then we'll see examples of each type. And some of these I'll show will be actual office firms that are doing work. Some of them will be students. They're kind of all mixed together, right? But you can get a lot of good ideas out of these. Okay? So we have some primary diagrammatic techniques. Number one is the figure ground, which I'll talk about each one of these in length, but it's kind of the solid and void diagrammatic technique. We have highlighting, where we focus on a specific area of the building and we highlight that area, right? We have areas. We have arrows and flow lines, things that draw through or show movement through a building, sun through a building, that kind of thing. We have various components. We might use a combination of text to identify parts of the building, and we might try to show movement. It is important to recognize that these are not separate entities, right? You can always combine, say, a figure ground with highlighting. You could combine arrows and flow lines with movement. There's lots of combinations of these techniques, right? So it's actually hard when I'm showing examples to distill it down into, it's only this, right? A lot of times you combine multiple pieces together. So let's start with the figure ground. And the figure ground is really about creating a strong graphic representation of a dichotomy, public versus private, right? Two things that are opposites. And how do we show those two things, right? The solid and the void. So we'll go way back in time. This is Noli's plan of Rome. And he drew this, and it looks very much, I know it's a little blurry. I'm going to show you a blown up version in just a second. But he drew this plan of Rome. And if we look at it right now, it looks very much like a plan of Rome, right? Okay, well, actually, this isn't a plan of Rome. It's a diagram of Rome. If we look at the zoomed in version here, right, we can see a lot of things that are happening. And in this particular case, I picked out the Plaza del Popolo right there and a variety of streets. But if we look closely, look right here, for example. Okay, we can see not only the street, but we can see inside the church. Okay? So instead of showing this is just a plan of Rome and here's the buildings, what Noli did is he said this is the public area of Rome versus the private area of Rome. Everything that's white in this drawing, and recognize this drawing is really big. Okay? Everything that's white in this drawing is public. I can step foot in it. I don't have to be a private citizen. I can just walk in. Okay? So churches, plazas, all of those things are public spaces. Therefore, they're included in white in his drawing. The private spaces are the black areas, and they're the contrast. So they provide the context of the city of Rome. Okay? Kind of interesting. Okay? So this is called figure ground or solid and void. But it's not done just way back in time. It's done today. And you've probably seen stuff like this before. Right? Here's an example of a couple little drawings that represent a museum, right, shown on like a graphic board. This is what's available in the museum. These are the exhibits. They're using the exact same technique here. Right? The things that are white are public. You can go there. You can look at the exhibits. The things that are this lightish blue color are the private areas, the collections, the back areas, the back rooms. Okay? So they're doing the same strategy here many, many years later. This is from a library competition by Rem Koolhaas, and this is the kind of the model of it. Doesn't have anything to do with figure ground, but we're going to move forward into figure ground. So here's the library, and the idea is that it's this big, solid, massive object, and there's these open voids that happen inside this big, solid mass, right? So they use the same strategy to represent their ideas. This is a study model of it. Okay, so here's their diagrams. And these happen to be in section instead of plan, but the concept is still very much the same. The mass, the books, the archive part of this library is shown in black, and the congregation spaces, the reading rooms, those kinds of spaces are shown in white. Okay? The spaces we can inhabit are shown in white. So let's look at the plan. They did every floor as part of this, and we can see very clearly, right, through these diagrams of the different levels, what's happening and where the spaces are that you can congregate. So it's about a contrast. Right? This is where I can congregate. This is where the books are stored. So it's always about a contrast in this sort of strategy. Okay? This is a book called The Endless City that does a bunch of diagrams of different cities and compares them to each other. They use very much the same strategies. Right? In this case, they're using a couple different colors to identify different things, but it's still very much about the contrast. Right, here we go. More examples. Right, sometimes it's fun to see the actual city and then they rearranged so you can see all the various regions put together. Okay, so let's move on from figure ground to highlighting. So highlighting is very much like we do when we get out a highlighter and we color parts of a book. Right, you're reading your English book or your chemistry book or your biology book or whatever it is that you're reading, and you want to remember something, so you get out that trusty highlighter and you highlight it. Right? The risk of highlighting is always that if you highlight too much, nothing's really special. Right? Anybody done that before? Like you're reading along, you just, oh, this is important, this is important, this is important, and then you look back and it's all yellow. And you're like, well, that didn't help. Okay? So the key here is to highlight the differences within the design framework, the small pieces of the puzzle, right, that really accentuate. Okay? It can be done in your models and it can be done in your drawings. Right? You highlight a little bit. Sometimes color coding is the easiest way to think of this. Okay? So you're trying to basically point attention to a specific thing. Okay? So here we have an example. Sorry, the lines are a little bit light here. But in this example, we have the old building shown in yellow. Right? Clearly, that's the old building. Then we have the new building, and we have the upper two floors shown in red, and the blue floor shown in blue. So there's clearly a difference between the old and the new, and there's also clearly a difference between the upper two floors and the lower floor. And I don't know what the building is, and I don't know what the difference is, but I can still see that there's a difference. And that's a big part of this highlighting strategy. Okay? Another example here, highlighting, same drawing, repeated 6 times, highlighting different pieces of the building. So again, you could look at this as color coding. Right? We have the office space in that teal color. Then we have business support in the orange color. Then we move on to welfare facilities. And so you can see how these various pieces overlap. Okay? But it's very much, this is this. This is this. We're highlighting it. Okay? We're borrowing again from Alex Holgraf here. This is the visualizing architecture guy that I talked about on his website. Hopefully you guys visited his website to see some of the stuff that he does. But he has great graphics. And so in this example, here's a diagram that he worked through. Right? We have the building shown on the right with a little bit of diagrammatic stuff happening. Right? And then we have the plan view that contrasts. So if we look here, for example, right, we have this little... you're never going to see it in that color. Hold on. Let's see if we can change colors. Right there. Okay. That little 1 with the little tail of the arrow is the same as this 1 with the tail of the arrow. So we see it in plan coming out to this circle. We see the same thing happening here, and we have the end highlighted. So you see how it's corresponding 1-to-1 between those two pieces. Okay? Same thing happens here with 2. There's our 2. Here, let me clear this for a second. There's our 2 going to this, where we see these 2 items. Same thing here. There's our 2 going out, and we're seeing those items out at the end. Okay? So he's combining the plan and the perspective view in still a very diagrammatic form. Another set of 3 here. This has to do with certain views that happen. We've got the plan view with the little gradient that comes off of the plan view that represents the perspective view at the bottom. Okay, so he's highlighting the perspective view. Right, this is a student example, computer drawn. Okay, and to me, this one is probably the over-the-top example of what color coding can become. Right? There's too many colors. It looks kind of like a rainbow threw up all over this drawing. Okay? But it still works pretty effectively because we can clearly see, okay, the purple is the theater part. Right? The supporting retail is clearly the red. Okay? I think this would be a little bit more successful if it was 6 different drawings with 1 color on each drawing rather than trying to combine them all together. And that's one of the things you'll have to learn about diagramming is what is too much, what is too little. And do you show lots of versions with different pieces, or do you show them all combined together in one? Okay. Another example here, I have no idea what this project was, nor what was really trying to be represented, but there's clearly a contrast. We have the red, we have the blue, and we have the black. right? The black represents what's existing. The red is different from the blue, whatever that different is. Okay? If I was actually looking at this as a live drawing, as part of an architectural project, there would be something more that supports what the difference between red and blue is. But we're looking at this in a vacuum, and we understand that there is a difference between them. Another example here, again using red and blue to contrast. In this particular example, this was a building that was designed on the edge of a river. The city was to the back, which was the red area. The aquatic environment, the river, was in blue. The building is shown as white, as spanning those two pieces. So it's still very clearly a diagram between the dark, dense city in red and the aquatic environment, or the natural environment, shown in blue. Another here where we have a series of drawings, and let me just advance to the next page here because I think it's a little bit easier. Color-coded, right, highlighting specific areas of what happens in the building. Right? We have the cores, we have the commercial space, we have the housing space, we have the offices, we have the hotel and restaurant all combined together. But this is very effective shown as different pieces. When we see them all combined together, again, I think it's a little bit too much. Right? And I'd rather see it as separate little pieces. But this had to do with how the building could change over time depending on what the demand was for certain pieces of the building. So showing them together kind of makes sense in this context. Another example from Alex Holgraf, going through a series of highlighted pieces. Right? What is each particular element and how it comes together to make up the overall building. Okay? We move from highlighting into the world of arrows and or flow lines that tend to represent movement or views or sunlight or something that's entering and exiting a space. Right? It's no surprise that arrows would be representative of that. The thing about it is it doesn't actually require arrows to show where this movement is. And this drawing here happens to be one of my favorites in diagrammatic terms. And if we look down here right at the bottom, we see that we have a red line that starts out thick that enters the building. Right? And as we go forward, and I'm going to draw on top of it here, right? As we go forward, a little tiny piece pulls off and goes down. Right? So as the people walk in, the mass of people are walking in, a part of it peels off and goes down to the lower level. Right? Then we move forward with a fairly thick line up to the first level here, and the line splits, and part of the people move down, and part of the people continue up. So just by the varying thickness of this line, starting from thick and getting thinner as it goes up, we can see the distribution of people and where they start to go as part of this building. So it's very much a diagram about movement and how people are moving through a particular building. So this is a project that was done by Takaharu and Yui Tezuka in Japan. They do an incredible amount of work. And I have a book in my office of their first collected works. And you can see a bunch of their work. You probably would recognize a few of their buildings, or at least you may have seen a few of their buildings. Not this one. This was a much smaller house, but it's called the floating roof house. And so this was his first diagram of what this house was. And if we look at this diagram, it's pretty clear that it has to do with, and let me change my color back to red. I think it's easier for you guys to see here. It has to do with a roof right there, right? It has to do with this hillside that comes down. And it has to do with the idea that the roof floats above the hill. So by drawing the diagram with just a strong section line here, just the roof, and a little arrow that goes through, we get a sense for what this floating roof house really is about. So let's see some actual technical drawings of it. So here's our perspective view. We have, again, the strong section line. This is a really nice drawing, right? We have the floating roof. We have a little bit more about the house. Let's see what it looks like in practice. Okay, so this was the actual building that was done. Floating roof. The roof floats above the house. The hillside flows through the building. So you can see, based on the photograph, that this is really representative of the diagram. The diagram is representative of what the actual building turned out to be. Another example here of the end of the building. You can see all the doors and the fact that they can open up or close. It's really, really nicely done. All right, another example here. We have these lines that radiate off these volumes They probably have some connection to a distant object or a view corridor or something like that. But again, we don't have enough context to really understand what's happening. Right? Another example here where we have lines that connect various pieces across a center stage of some kind. Right? Another example where we have this center piece and that it has a connection to the surrounding street or a view to the surrounding street. So using the arrows. To me, this one's a little bit chunky, but you get the idea. Right? Sometimes we use arrows to represent wind or air movement or sun, something along those lines. In this case, it has to do with cooling wind coming from one side of the building and flowing out through the other side of the building. This actually isn't technically correct in terms of how it would work. If they were trying to employ stack cooling, the air would come in from this side here, and it would actually come up and go out there because hot air rises. So the fact that it's blowing through the building is a little weird, but you get the idea. Okay? So the other thing that we can do is we can separate our building into components. We could take individual pieces and break them apart. And you've probably seen this done many times before in books, where we have, say, the skin of the building, we draw it, and we pull it off the building, and we can see inside. Right? This happens very frequently as a way of identifying pieces of the building. It's a great way of showing the difference between structure and mechanical systems or a variety of different pieces and how they come together to form the building as a whole. So let's look at some examples of this. Right? So this one I'd encourage you to look at afterward on the computer, on the slides afterward, because it's a much nicer graphic than it shows up. It's too white on the board here. But it has to do with a strong skeletal skin that forms over this building, covering up this volume underneath. Right? And so this skeletal form is lifted up off the building as part of the diagrammatic technique. So we see the mass of the building underneath, and we see this light skeletal form being pulled up off the building. Right? Sometimes it's about little structural examples. So on this side, we have a set of columns, and we have the skin and how they work together to form the building. Okay? So this is the Sendai Mediatek, which was done by Toyo Ito. Anybody heard of this building before? No? Okay, maybe you'll recognize it in the pictures. So this is the diagram of the building. Okay? And all the lettering, everything's written in Japanese, so I can't read any of it. Okay? Maybe somebody here can, but I can't. Okay? But I can look at this drawing, and I can get a sense for what's happening in the building. Okay? So if I look at this, and I say, okay, we have a basic building envelope that happens here. Okay? And he drew it like that. Then we also have a variety of floors that happen that go across the building. Okay? So I can tell that this is a multi-story building. We've got some floor plates happening. But then there's these masses that twist and curve up through the building. Okay? Well, if I'm thinking about this in architectural terms, those masses must have great importance, because he's showing them here, and he's kind of highlighting what they're doing, right, and why they're there. So those are probably the key element. We have a square building, we have flat floor plates, and we have these twisting structures that somehow go up through it. So what could those twisting structures represent? Right? Well, maybe they have something to do with the building itself. So let's take a step back. Another set of diagrams relating to this building. We talked about figure ground before, the solid and the void. This is a media library. So he's shown on each floor, right? He's shown the representation in the figure ground of this is where the media is stored, this is where the public space is, etc. So he's using that same strategy that we talked about earlier. Okay? Another example here, taking it a step forward, we have a skin applied to the building, we have our floor plates, and we have these tubes that run up through the building. Okay? So the tubes are obviously of key importance to how this building really works. Okay? And in fact, the tubes are quite critical to the overall building. So here it is in photographic form. We have our open floor plans, and the only structure that's happening in the building, the only thing that's holding one floor apart from another floor, are these twisting structures. But he's doubling up. They're not just structurally important, they're also for all the mechanical and building systems. So if we look here carefully, you can see in one of the larger pieces, that's where the emergency stairwell goes up. Right? If we look at the one to the right here, that's where the elevator core goes up through the building. So these twisting structures provide all of the mechanical and support for these buildings, right, including how people move through the floors and travel from floor to floor. So really kind of interesting strategy for this particular building. There it is from the outside. We can see the floor plates, and we can see those twisting tubular structures that come up through the floor. Okay? So kind of interesting. I have to tell a side story because I think this is fun. Okay? So let's say, for example, you were in this building, and you were up on the top floor, up here. Okay? And suddenly a fire broke out right here, raging fire. Okay? Well, obviously you'd want to get out of the building, right? Okay? So you'd come down in one of these tubes. Okay? Well, you have the emergency staircase coming down through the tube, but notice the sides of these tubes are all glass. Be kind of weird to be walking past the raging fire, wouldn't you say? Okay? So he, as the architect, Toyo Ita, had to come up with some strategy for how am I going to keep people calm, and furthermore, how am I going to make this safe for somebody to be able to get from one of the upper floors out through the lower floor. So he used a really special kind of glass, and this is going off on a materials tangent, but I used to teach that class. I like that class. Anyway, he used a very special kind of glass. So in between two layers of glass, so here we only have one layer of glass, but imagine we had two layers of glass. In between, they fill the glass with a transparent gel. It's called intumescent gel. Okay? And they put this intumescent gel on in between the two glass, and it is resistant to fire and causes the glass not to break and become a fireproof wall. Really cool technology. Okay? Furthermore, he had the choice of having the gel turn opaque when the fire would heat it or stay transparent. He chose to make it opaque so that people wouldn't freak out and see the fire on the other side of the glass wall. Okay? But that is a perfect example of the advancement of building technology that we can start to use today. And it had nothing to do with architectural diagrams, but I had to tell you about it because it's too cool. Okay? Sorry for the tangent. Another example here of structural tension on this particular shape. Exploded axonometric. We have the core of the building. We have the various components of the building, the skin, etc., all pulled away from the building so we can see and identify what those pieces are. Another example here is something about a building with these jewels or these highlighted pieces that float inside of the building floor plates and how they work together. Structural skin on a building in diagrammatic form. Right? This one is a thermal systems diagram. It has to do with how the heat happens in a particular building. There's a slight gradient coming up from the bottom in red showing that there's radiant heat. It's also a stack cooling where you have blue air coming in the bottom, red air going out the top. So it's kind of like an arrow. It's just shown as a gradient instead of an arrow. By the way, it's much clearer on the actual version, so you have to look at it later. Anybody been to the Pantheon before? Was it awesome? Awesome. Okay, so you all have homework. If I could make you go there right now, I would make you go there right now, but I can't. Okay? But at some point in your life, if you stay in the world of architecture, you will end up in Rome. It's kind of an inevitable fact. Okay? And if you end up in Rome, okay, this is your homework, and this is like lifelong homework. It just needs to happen for you. Okay? And you will thank me for it, I promise. Okay? Go buy yourself a cup of coffee and go sit in this building for like 40 minutes. Okay? It is by far the coolest building you will ever sit in. It's just unbelievably spectacular. Yes? Yes. Thank you. Thank you. So those couple of you that have visited, you would agree with me, right? Yeah. Okay, so if we look at this building in diagrammatic sense, okay, one of the things that's really interesting about the building is a perfect sphere would sit inside of this building. And so we see it in this view where we have, right, all of our structure and our heavy mass and all the rest of it, but inlaid is this light little circle that goes around, and I can't draw a perfect circle, but you get the idea, right? That represents what would fit. So it's 150 feet across, and it's 150 feet tall. Okay, so it's a perfect dome. Okay? By the way, this was the largest dome until 1946. Okay, so it was built 118 AD or CE, depending on which term we're using now. I'm not a history person. Okay, pretty long span for this dome. Okay, Very, very cool building. Let's see some background information because I can't help but show it. Okay? So here's the front doors. Okay, coming into the building. It always looks so small. Right? And until you start to visit places outside of the United States, you don't get a sense for what scale really is. Okay? So there it is from the outside. Not particularly exciting from the outside. Right? Not well decorated from the outside, but inside, mind-blowing. Okay? So we see the people. You see the first layer of columns here. Let's go back a couple slides. Okay? That layer of columns and the people is only showing us this part of the building. Right? There's the tops of the columns that I was just showing. Look at, it's almost 2/3 as tall from there. Big difference in scale from what we can see. And even in that picture, we can see how small the people really are. Right? Look at how tiny the people are. Right? Anyway, really, really neat building and worth just taking some time and sitting there and absorbing it. Okay? Sometimes it's about a cycle, something that happens at one time of day versus another time of day. So in this case, it had to do with what the building looked like during the day, what the building would look like at night. Okay? Typography is another technique, and I will admit that this was not one that I used extensively when I was in grad school or in undergrad, but it is becoming a little bit more trendy right now to use, and it can work really well. It's kind of like the word art that you did a little bit ago in this class, right? But you're using that to represent key concepts in your design. So here we are, and again, this is an Alex Holgraf drawing, which makes it really nice looking, but we see that instead of trying to put little arrows and text that describes it, he's using large text, and he's using that text to represent what's happening in a certain area of the building. Okay? So this large text is actually a combination and part of the drawing itself. Right? It is part of the diagram. Another example here, you have a stage, and you have a variety of things happening around the stage, and you're identifying this is the stage because of that. Another example here where we have various pieces put together. These are, this was a library. I think it's in Seattle, the diagram for that. And this is what's happening in each region of the building identified by text. Okay, so it's very much a diagrammatic technique. It's a little bit more abstract. It's harder to see the architecture, but it's a good informative way of understanding what's happening in a particular building. So in this example, we have a variety of connected pieces that's happening via text. We have the pluses and the minuses and how they relate to one another. Again, I don't know the scope of that project particularly well. So then we have movement. And this is very much about how people move through space. We could do, and this is, it kind of overlaps with Flowlines a little bit, but I like to highlight it a little bit better. And that has to do with how people are moving through space. And it's generally represented by lines or dots or collections of lines and dots, and how that kind of thing happens across a plan, generally in plan. Okay? Anybody heard of cab spotting before? No? Good. Okay, anybody recognize this? Nice. This is very much San Francisco. Okay? So this is not a map of San Francisco. It's not a drawing of San Francisco, right? Yet you were able to recognize that it's San Francisco. Okay. What? One-on-one. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So one of the things that's really interesting about something like this is this was set up by the Exploratorium a while back, and they track the GPS in all the cabs in the city of San Francisco. And so as they track this, and they used to have like a live showing of where the cabs currently were and how they were moving. It was really cool. Anyway, this is a static image of it. But what this does is it shows us the density of how people are moving through the city. And it really shows us where the primary roads and streets and freeways are. And therefore, we can discern this is very much San Francisco. Okay? So what would happen down here? Airport. Right? A lot of traffic to that airport. We've got the Bay Bridge. You get the idea. Okay? So it isn't San Francisco. It isn't a map of San Francisco. It is just a diagram of San Francisco. Okay? I used a similar strategy. This is a little bit more graphic, but this had to do with flight patterns into and out of SFO as part of my thesis. Same concept, where you're drawing the movement of people, or in this case, planes. Okay? This was SFO back when I did my thesis, terminal 2 is right here, but it was not being used at the time that I was working on my thesis. And this had to do with how people moved through the terminals. Okay, so I sat there and I drew little dots as people moved. It was a very tedious sort of thing. But you can see where various lines formed and that sort of thing. So it is not a plan of the airport, right? It's a diagram of how people move through the airport. Okay? And that's one of the key ideas behind this. A little bit zoomed in version of this. This one is an example of, and it's blown up. This was part of a much larger drawing, but this had to do with view corridors. So you wanted a private pool at the end of this set of hallways. So how do you hide based on the kinks in the hallway where somebody can see you? Right? It was a bathhouse design. Right? Another example here, this is a site diagram. This is the site that I'm working with. This is the context that I'm working from. Okay, what's happening? So this was as part of our thesis. When we were first starting with our thesis, we were asked to diagram what our thesis process was going to be and how clear it was, etc. So this was actually 2 cards, a front and a back. This was what I thought my thesis was, and this is what my thesis became. Right? So it's very much about this is what I was thinking at the time, and this is how confusing stuff got. Okay? So you can diagram your thoughts. Right? Again, example of movement through a particular building. We have the dotted lines shown. Right? Trajectory into the final building and how people move through the final building. Okay? Series of drawings showing a variety of things happening as part of the building. In the third one over, we see the sun movement shown with an arrow. Right? This is kind of the over-the-top, too much environmental systems happening in this drawing, but we see lots of arrows representing what's happening: the sun, the wind, the heat, the air, etc. Okay? Again, I would probably separate them out, make it a black and white drawing. It's a little too much going on. You can get rid of the ridiculously corny clip art sun. Okay? Just food for thought. Another example of a cab spotting-like diagram. And then we have transformations. Okay? This usually involves 2 drawings where this is how it's normally done. What if we did it this way? Right? So this is before, this is after. Right? So it takes 2 drawings to do it. What if this, skyscrapers, and we turned it into this? Okay? So it's a what if. Right? Typically, it's this. What if we did this? Okay? So again, 2 parts in these. Another example here, what if we had this mass? What if we cut it? And then what if we turned one around? So this before, this after. All right? So I'm going to stop talking about diagrams, and we're going to go into the world of Illustrator, and I'm going to talk through a bunch of strategies for how do we draw these sorts of things. So bear with me for a second while we switch over, and then we'll keep going. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through a variety of diagrammatic techniques, and as part of your exercise 117, I'm asking you to pick a building to diagram. And you could pick something like, say, the Pantheon to diagram. You could pick a more modern building. The one that I think works really well, at least as an explanation, is a building called the Kimball Art Museum. Anybody heard of that before? Right? If you haven't, I'm sure you will at some point. But if we look up, let's look at Google Images. Oh, of course I have no internet connection. Why would I have an internet connection? All right, well, we're going to look at examples of the Kimball Art Museum in a little bit, but I have already downloaded the section of the Kimball Art Museum. Let me open that up really fast so that we can see it, and then we'll go through how to diagram on top of it. So the Kimball Art Museum is a series of barrel-vaulted spaces, so just a half-circle barrel vault, but they have a really, really unique nice way of bringing in light to the space. It comes through this oculus that runs down the length of the barrel vault, bounces off of these two light diffusing sheets, back up onto the dome, and then radiates down the dome onto the side galleries. So it's no direct light in the space, but really well lit in the particular space. So it becomes a really great building to kind of diagram or talk about. And so I'll use that as my example. I wish I could show you pictures, but of course my internet is not working. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Adobe Illustrator. And now that Illustrator is open, I'll go to File and New. And under New, I'm going to choose a letter size page, and I'm going to have it going landscape orientation. Notice also that I can click on Advanced, and since we just talked about color theory, I think this is a good place to point this out. If I were going to print this, I'd have it in CMYK. For right now, I'm going to be posting it online, so I'll switch to RGB. But again, it doesn't really matter for right now which version you're in. They can all be converted back and forth, but that's something that we talked about before. So here I am, and I have my 8.5 by 11 document, and I'm going to start by placing in that section image of the Kimball Art Museum. So I'll go ahead and go to File and then Place, and I'm going to pick that image. There it is. And I'll go ahead and place it. It turns out rather large, so let's go ahead and shrink it down. And I'll shrink it down by clicking on the Free Transform tool, which is the arrow and kind of a square with little dots on it on the left-hand side here. I'll click on that, and I'll make this smaller. Now notice if I don't hold down Shift, I can skew the image, which defeats the accuracy of this diagram. So I'm going to make sure while I'm moving this and making it smaller, I'm going to hold down Shift so that it stays in proportion. And I'm going to get it so that the art museum here fits nicely on my page, something like that. Okay? Now if I look over at my layer stack, which is over here, by the way, I am working in the Essentials workspace. And so if you aren't in the Essentials workspace, you can switch to the Essentials. If you've customized it or somebody else has customized it on your computer, you can always reset it back to the default Essentials workspace. And on the right side, I'm going to click on the layer stack, and we see that I have one layer. And this layer currently has on it, if I click the little triangle, one linked file. That linked file is representative of this drawing that I've already put in. Okay, so I'm going to rename this layer, and I'll do that by double-clicking on it. And I'm going to call it my base drawing. Come on. Just to make sure that it's clear down the road. And I'm also going to take my base drawing, and I'm going to select it, and I'm going to make it not quite so dark. And so I'll come up over here to the transparency window, and I'm going to change, the opacity to maybe like 40% or so. You guys can still see that okay. So it's not so overpowering as part of the drawing. Okay? So we'll leave that at about 40%. And now that I'm done with that, I'm going to go to my layers again, and I'm going to go ahead and lock the base drawing layer so that I can't accidentally select it or move it or change it. Okay? So then I'll add an additional layer, and I'm going to call this additional layer Diagram 1. And I'm going to use this layer to do my first diagram. Now sometimes, before I start actually doing the diagram, I need a little bit more context of the building. I want to highlight something a little bit more. So it may be beneficial to have one more layer, and I'll call this layer 3 building. And I also want to make sure it's below the diagram 1 layer. So I'll drag it down below the diagram 1 layer. There it is. And so with the building layer selected, I'll go ahead and use the pen tool. And I'm going to draw or trace over this building a little bit. I'll have to do a few modifications here. Okay, I'm getting a fill color of white. I don't want a fill color of white. I just want my So you guys are all experts with the pen tool now. So this should be a quick process. Okay, I may have to make a few modifications. This one, for example, needs to be pulled out. More like that. This one also needs to be pulled up a little bit like that. And then I could flip this so that it was filled instead. Let me shorten this up a little bit. Yeah, about like that. Okay. So I've just drawn in kind of a solid poche for the roof, a little bit more detail. Let me go ahead and take this shape. I'm going to copy it, Control-C. I'll Control-V to paste it, and then I'm going to reflect it. So I will go to Object. I'm going to go to Transform, and I'm going to reflect. Vertical. Say OK. Gives me the other half and saves me from having to actually draw it. Okay. It might not be perfectly accurate, but you guys get the idea. Okay. Furthermore, I probably should draw these little pieces in, these little arcs. So let me go ahead with the pen tool. And once again, we'll trace this. Maybe like that. And I'm going to flip this to be just a line. And then we'll thicken up the line. Maybe like that. It's a little lumpy. Let's see if we can smooth it out a little bit. Yeah, it's not bad. Okay. Let me take this. And again, I'm going to Control-C to copy, Control-V to paste. And then I'll Object, Transform, Reflect. And we'll go vertical. There it is. And we'll push this one right up there. And we get the second half. Okay? So all I've done is I've traced the building so that I have some kind of black pieces that are representative of what's happening in the building, such that I could really turn off the base drawing and I'd still get a sense for this is what the section is like. Right? And if I were really doing this, I might add a little bit more like here's the wall as part of the building or something else. But for right now, I'm not going to worry about it. We're just talking about the roof. And so what I'll do is I'm going to start with trying to diagram what's happening up here on the roof. Okay? So the first way of doing this might be, and I'll move to the diagram 1 layer, might be to show how light's coming down and bouncing off of this deflector or diffuser up to the roof and down to the wall here. So I'll start with the pen tool. And we'll draw a line that goes down there, comes across, hits here, and then comes down toward the wall here. Okay? And maybe I'd do a second one to show that if it was a different time of day, it would come in and hit higher, and then hit lower, and then hit down that way, or something like that. Okay, so I have a couple different versions. And it may be useful, right? If I look at this just in all black, it kind of gets confusing, wouldn't you say? So maybe these lines should really be yellow rather than black. Right? And we love to use yellow or orangey yellow or whatever as a representation of sunlight. So let's go ahead and change the color. And we'll come down here into a kind of a yellowish color. Pick something about like that. And we'll go ahead and say OK. And now that is more orangey yellow in color. And it's definitely different than my original image. Okay? So this is shown currently as just a line. The thickness is exactly the same as these other two lines that represent my diffusers, and I'd rather have it slightly different. So I'm going to go back to my line, and maybe I'll change my stroke to be thicker, right? Maybe something like that. And that may then involve a little bit of adjustment so that this isn't quite overlapping my piece. If I wanted to make this match up the same as this, I could select this first curve using the black arrow, and I could use the eyedropper tool, and it would copy the color. I already have the colors as being the same, but it also copies the line weight. So I'm able to just copy it over without going in and adjusting my settings. Okay? So the other thing that can be useful is to put an arrow head on the end of one of these lines. So if I took this line, for example, and I went to my stroke and I said Show Options, at the bottom here I have something called arrowheads. Okay? And I have an arrowhead at the start and an arrowhead at the end. I'm going to use the one for the end, which is the one on the right. And I can choose one of these arrowheads. So for example, I could pick arrow 10, and you see that I now have a little arrow at the end, okay, which is kind of convenient. Some of these are cornier than others. Right? We could have the giant blocked arrow. Those tend to be a little bit heavy-handed. If the scale was too large, if the arrow was too large and you wanted a smaller one, you could adjust the percentage, say, to maybe 50%, and the arrow gets a little bit smaller. Might help, right? But you also may want to play around with what other arrows are available. Sometimes those style arrows tend to work a little bit better. Let me go back up to 100 so that it matches the line weight, right? Something like that. It's not my favorite, okay? So what I'll do is I'll take this line again, and I'm going to turn it off. By the way, they do have tails for the arrows too. If you come down here, you can do, like the archery tail, etc. But they also have dots and squares and little symbols that can be useful. You could even do the cartoon hand if you wanted to. I wouldn't do it, but anyway, you get the idea. Okay, so let's go back and turn these off so that there's none. And let's make this a little bit more technical. Okay, let's take this line, and let's, instead of using just a plain line, let's come up and use our brushes. And so we talked about brushes a little bit first. Up here across the top, we have a variety of preset brushes. We have, for example, a round brush. And what the round brush does, and let me make this a little bit larger so you can see it better, right, is it makes the brush head be round. And so it rounds each corner and it rounds the end. We could change, however, and use an oval brush. If we come over here to the oval, you'll see that it's represented by an oval. So it's fatter in this direction, a little bit thinner in this direction, and gets fatter in that direction. Okay? We can move over. This is also an oval, but it's in a different orientation. So again, it gives us a different line. This here is a flat brush, which means it's just straight, which means it's coming down, folding, and then coming over, and then going down a little bit. So it's varying the width because of the style of brush head that we're using. We can also load up a bunch of presets. So if we go to Open Brush Library, we could go to Artistic, and we could say maybe the chalk, charcoal, and pencil. And we could pick a line that was a little bit more sketchy in nature, maybe something like that. Right? And that may be beneficial. So let's take this and also apply that line to it. We have two versions. Maybe I want to put an arrow on the end. I could draw the arrowhead myself. And I could apply this to it. And move it over. And then I could have that arrow if I wanted it. Okay? I also might choose to make these lines a little bit more transparent. If I went to transparency, I could change the opacity maybe to 70% so they weren't quite as strong as they were coming in. And you could see a little bit more overlap in how those worked. Okay? So in this strategy, we're talking about doing the light via little arrows. Another option might be to do it as like a gradient. And so I'll show you the gradient example next. So let me turn off diagram 1. And I'm going to create a new layer for diagram 2. And we'll make that one active. And now I'll go ahead and draw a shape in here. So let me go ahead and I'll use a fill color so that this becomes a little bit more obvious. And let me come in here as if I had light coming in. And unfortunately, I can't see right now, so let me flip it back to this. And okay, and then I can flip this over that, and we can see the region. And let me make a quick adjustment to this arc, like that. And now I have the region highlighted in this kind of yellow. But if we look at it, it's a little bit heavy-handed, right? Light isn't quite that solid of an object. So it'd be nice to have it start out dark here and then kind of diffuse out the way light would. So in this context, I'm going to select my shape right here. And its fill color is already this yellow. But I can come up over here and choose the gradient window. And when I choose the gradient window, I can now apply a linear gradient to this shape. And so right now it's applying from right to left, which is not exactly how I want it to be. Let's switch it to be, say, 90, which means it's going from dark to light this time. And I want to change my color to be that yellowish color. So right down here in the gradient slider, I'm going to double click on the black, and I'm going to change that black to be that yellow color that I had before. And if I had the yellow color as a swatch, it would be really easy to pick it. I'm just going to go ahead and pick some yellow. Oh, those are terrible. Oh, whatever. You guys get the idea. Okay? So I can pick that yellow. It's a linear gradient from here to here, and it's now representing how light comes into the space. It would be nice, though, if the darker yellow went a little bit down further. So I'm going to pull this over a little bit, which is going to make more yellow at the top and shrink the gradient down just a little bit. So more yellow up here in the high part and fade out toward the bottom. Okay? Likewise, I could also adjust the opacity so we had a little bit of transparency there and we could see through and see some of the lines underneath. I can see it, but you guys can't, so let me adjust it down a little bit more, and then maybe you can see it like that. So then I could take this shape, we could copy it, Control-C, Control-V to paste, and once again, I could go to Object, Transform, and then Reflect, and then we could put it on this half as well. Okay? So that represents how the light's coming in and then diffusing out. Okay? When it comes to your final product, whatever your final product is, when you do your export, you may or may not want to include the information from your image behind. Obviously, I chose to redraw parts of this image. If I were to turn off the base drawing altogether, you could still get a very clear sense of what's happening in the building. Sometimes having the base drawing behind gives a little bit more context, and it can be nice. But you have to make sure that the background information, this base drawing, doesn't overpower what's really happening, right, in the diagram. So it's much more about the diagram itself, not what's happening in the background. And so maybe the base drawing should actually be even more transparent. Maybe we should drop it down to maybe 20%. Now you guys can't see that. I can still see it. Maybe 30, right? Something like that. So it's not overpowering the diagram, and that's really critical. Okay, so I've done that as planned. Let me go ahead and create a new drawing, and we're going to do a, that was a section. We're going to do a plan. Let me go to File and then Place, and I'll drop in the plan. And it's a little bit small, so I use the free transform tool to make this a little bit larger. Like that. And I'm going to work with only this plan right now. We can pull that off the edge there. There we go. And so now I need to go ahead and start drawing on top of this. Just like I did before, we'll make layer 1 the base drawing, and I'm going to lock it. Okay. Then I'll go ahead and create a layer for the building. We'll make that active, and I'll really quickly trace the building. And you guys don't want to sit here and watch me, accurately trace the building. So we're just going to do some fundamental outlines here. And let me flip so that I'm in outline mode. Go there. All right, so I've worked my way around the building like that. We'll add a few more pieces inside, maybe from there to there, and maybe from there to there. Maybe we'll go up and across, something like that. Okay, so if I were to turn off the background, we'd get that I drew a little bit of the plan. Okay, something like that is pretty good. There's a few pieces that need some touch-up. Maybe we'll put this over so that it it matches up right on that corner. Let me draw this over until it matches up to there. We'll draw that like that. OK, so anyway, I could spend more time making it accurate, but I've essentially drawn pieces of the plan. So let's start by diagramming how somebody might move through this space. OK, so I'll go to my next layer, and we'll call this diagram 3. And I'm going to start by using my pen tool on the diagram 3 layer, and I'm going to draw a line of how somebody might move through this particular building. So maybe I'll start here, and somebody's going to come in through the door like that. They're going to come through this door, and they're going to walk down into this gallery, and they're going to come around here, and they were bored, so they came right back out. Something like that. Okay? Then I'll start, and I'll do this again, and I'll say, OK, well, this person, maybe they liked the building a little bit more, so they came in here, and they walked through here, and then they turned, and they spent some time in this gallery, and they went back, and they looked at these again because they liked it so much, and then they came along here, and they got lost, and they continued along here, and they said, oh, I want to see what's happening over here. And then they went through here, and they decided it would be fun to be out here for a little while. You get the idea, right? So I work my way through the building, creating these lines that represent how somebody's traveling through the building. And there we are. We end there. Okay? So these are then representing how somebody's moving through the space. And so maybe as number one, as these black lines, they're not showing up very well. So if I were to take them and maybe change their color to, say, like a brighter red or something, it might help them show up. And maybe they need to be a little bit thicker. So I could up the stroke. And now we can see those on top of the building, and they're a little bit more clear for showing how the people are moving through this particular space. It may be also helpful if I adjusted the opacity down just a little bit to maybe 70%, so we can still see through a little bit to the image behind. Okay, so we could take this a step further, though, and we could take these lines and we could convert them, under strokes, to having a dash to them rather than being just a solid line. And we can control in the dash line what the size of the dash is and what the gap size is. So for example, I could do a 1-point dash and a 1-point gap, and we'd have a line that's a much tighter dotted line. I could also, let me select them both again. I could also change this to maybe be a 4-point and a 4-point, right? And so now it's a little bit more even. Maybe I do a 12-point, a 4-point, and a 3-point, and now I can create a pattern to my lines. Okay, so I have a variety of strategies for how I can create that dash line should I want to make the dash line. I'm going to go ahead and turn the dash line off for a second, and I'm going to show you how to do something else. So let's say that instead of having a line going through the building, I really would rather have a set of footprints going through the building. Well, I can do that. I just have to start by drawing the footprints. Okay? So let me zoom in here a little bit. I'm just going to work in the white space over here, and I'm going to quickly draw a pair of footprints. And hold on one second while we flip this to be color. OK, so I drew a little footprint here. I have those two pieces. Somehow I made a mistake on the corner here. There we go. OK, so I have this footprint. Let me select it. I'm going to copy it, Control-C, Control-V to paste it. And then I'm going to reflect it. So I'll go to Object, Arrange, or excuse me, Object, Reflect, Horizontal. And I'll say, OK, that way they're opposites of each other. Okay? Then I'll set them up more like I was walking. So they're a little bit apart from one another. Okay? Then I will select these two shapes like this. I'm going to open the brush menu, and I'm going to drag these two shapes into the brush menu. So when I drag them in, you see how it creates a little orange line around my brush menu? When I do that, it's going to say, hey, do you want to create a new brush? And I'm not going to spend too much time talking about what these brushes are. But what I want is I want a scatter brush. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And it brings some options. And so we'll rename this to be footprints. And I want my size to be fixed. I want my spacing to be fixed. I want my scatter to be fixed. And I want my rotation not to be random, but we'll leave it to be fixed as well. And the rotation needs to be relative not to the page, but to the path. So they follow along the path. Okay? And now that I'm done, my colorization, we can do a tint. That's fine. And I'll go ahead and say OK. So that footprint brush now shows up in my little brushes. You see the two little footprints. Okay? So what I'll do is I'll go to my line right here, my first line, and I'll pick the footprints brush. Okay? So obviously they turned out much bigger than I wanted them to. So we're going to have to go into my stroke here, and we're going to have to change this to maybe 0.1. So they become little footprints. And maybe maybe they need to be 0.25. There you go. At some distance, they're the right look. But now instead of seeing a line, we're seeing little footprints that go through the building. Okay? And so maybe this is a little corny, but if done right, it could be a very nice strategy for how this works. Right? And one of the advantages here is that you can use the density of footprints. Right? So if I took my magic, or excuse me, if I took my eyedropper and I copied this, we'd have the same line over here. Nope. No, here we need the brush, footprints brush. And hold on a second. Let's go to my stroke, and it needed to be 0.25. There we go. We can start to see a density of where people are really walking and where that density occurs. So in this case, I've only drawn two people, but we can see the central corridor is a valuable piece of this building. Okay? And so as I drew more and more, we'd start to see very much like the cab spotting, where we'd have a density of this is where people are walking and this is where they're not walking. Okay? So that was how you create a little brush with footprints. So the next piece, and I'll promise I'll only show you one more. I know it's a lot to take in. But that this is something that you guys might end up using as part of your Charlie Harper, which is why I want to show you that. And I've already had this question several times. Let me turn off diagram 3. And let me turn off the base drawing. So I have just this set of lines. What if I want to fill in certain regions with color? Okay, and I already have some lines drawn. Now, obviously, if this is square, I could say, oh, well, let me come in here, and I can fill this region in red by just drawing a red box. And we'll adjust the opacity to 40%. Now that's color-coded. Okay? It's relatively easy. But if you have a complex drawing, right, where you don't have lots of regions already established, right, let me turn this back off for a second. Right? Let's say we take it a step further and we had some diagonal lines that went through the building. Oh, come on. I don't want a white line. I want a black line. All right, let me draw just a couple more lines through the building. Something like that. I do want all of these lines to be on the same layer, so let me select them all, and I'm going to move them all onto the building layer. So they're all on the building layer. Okay, now that I have these, I want to be able to selectively paint certain regions. So like I want to fill this shape right here with a color. I want to fill that shape with a different color. Okay? I can do this using something called a live paint, which is a very valuable tool to have. The key on a live paint is before you do the live paint, make a duplicate of the layer. So everything's currently on the building layer. I'm going to make a duplicate of that layer, and we'll rename this building dash LP for live paint, just so that I know that this is what I'm working on. Okay? And we'll actually move it below the building layer itself. So we can turn everything off except the building LP for live paint. And I'm going to select all of the objects. And it's important that you select them all before you do the live paint. And then I'll come over here and select the live paint bucket tool, which is underneath the shape builder tool. Right, it's right here, live paint, looks like a paint bucket. And when I do that and I move over my objects, it will say click to make a live paint group. Okay, that's what I want to do. I'll go ahead and click. And after I've clicked, you see how it selects the interior regions of my drawing? Okay, this will let me fill in any of those regions with a particular color. Okay, so I'll go ahead and I'll flip my color, and let's go ahead and pick a color. And I can now fill in whatever regions that I wanted to fill in are, something like that. I could switch my color to be a different color. And I could fill in these regions here as well. Okay? And again, it doesn't matter. You know, this has nothing to do with the Kimball Art Museum. I'm just trying to show you the general strategy. When I'm done with the live paint, right, there's a button right here at the top center that's called Expand. That will release the live paint and make these actual objects. And at that point, I can go ahead and use the direct select, the white arrow, and I can come in and I can select individual pieces. So maybe all of these orange objects, for example. And I can move them up onto my layer 4 diagram. Let me take my blue objects, and I'm just holding down Shift as I select them. And I'm going to move them up onto my building 4 diagram. And so now I have the colored regions available to me. And I also have a layer for building that's available. Maybe I'll move the building layer up on top like that. And then I could adjust the line weights on this layer. So let's make them a little bit thicker so you can see it. Maybe something like that. And so now we can see that I have this as a strategy. Okay? So the live paint can be very beneficial if you already have a line drawing and you need to fill in regions. Just make sure you do a duplicate of the layer of the lines before you do it. It's going to save you headaches down the road. Okay? The live paint, it's hidden underneath the shape builder tool. This is the shape builder. It's 2 circles with an arrow. If you click and hold, the live paint bucket is available there. The shortcut for it is K. If you press K on the keyboard, you can get there as well. Okay? Right. So the question was, when you're doing the Charlie Harpers, is it beneficial to do all the outlines in black and then use this live paint to fill in the regions? A lot of times it works well for people. Some people draw with the shapes and they fill in the shapes as they draw instead of just drawing the outlines. There's nothing wrong with that. It's essentially getting you to the same place. But some people prefer to just draw all the outlines and then do the live paint after the fact. So I wanted to show you that as a technique. Obviously, this would work as a diagrammatic technique. If I were to, for example, make this a little bit more diagram, I could select the layer 4. We could adjust the opacity of those, maybe at 50%. I could turn back on my plan underneath. And if this had something to do with the plan underneath, it would make more sense. But essentially, I'm working in conjunction and color coding the various regions. This is public, this is private, or something like that. All right? So I know it's a lot to take in. I know that was a lot of various techniques, but this is all kind of important stuff to get through. For today, I want you to do 2 diagrams, 1 plan and 1 section. Ideally, they're from the same building, but they don't have to be. Furthermore, if you have one of your own buildings from studio that you'd like to do a diagram of, I'm okay with that as well. But I'm looking for 1 post with 2 diagrams in it by the end today. I do want you to comment on this exercise. Okay? Are there any questions? No? All right. If I can get my internet to work, by the way, I will show you the Kimball Art Museum so you can see the actual pictures of what I was doing.